Hello, gunfighters, and welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting and gun-related stuff the right way with God at the center. So I think I'm going to forego the lengthy bio. Try to abbreviate it. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also, law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Pretty succinct. You want to support? Go to Patreon. Should be a link in the show notes. Boom. Saddle up for today's episode. The Smith & Wesson M&P All American 21st Century Combat Handgun. It saddens me that does not get the recognition that it deserves. It's an amazing handgun. I have won more shooting competitions with the Smith & Wesson M&P than any other model of firearm. And this is coming from somebody who transitioned from Glock, started shooting competition with a Glock, started carrying as a police officer with a Glock, and then later Sig Sauer 229. But I transitioned on my own to a Smith & Wesson M&P because I thought it was a better gun. And I'm going to make a bold statement. I don't think it's just a better gun for me. I think it's a better gun than a Glock, period. It's made in America. It's got a stainless steel slide, even though they coat it usually with black, whatever their coating is. It's American made. It's engineered very well. It's very simple. It's very rugged. It's much more ergonomic. I don't care how much you love Glocks. If you're being honest, you might have to concede that they have the ergonomics of a 2x4. Instead of just having just small back straps that go on the back of the gun, which I would concede do very little, they actually have different contours of grip inserts, which I think are great. I'd say for most people they point more naturally. They have that more natural grip angle. Even people that love Glocks, one of the first things they usually do when they get a Glock is put different sights on it, because the Glock sights that come from the factory are not stellar. The Smith & Wesson M&P sights are much better. They're about the same price. I'm going to say it's a better gun. The only real advantage I think that the Glock has is number one, market share, which is kind of one and the same, that equals to aftermarket support. There's arguably a lot more aftermarket support for Glocks, different things. But I would say a lot of that is negated because the Smith & Wesson M&P requires less to be done to it in the first place. But, you know, if you're talking about aftermarket support, different sights, different holsters, stuff like that, that has to go to the Glock. It has such a big market share. But I'm going to tell you, comparing apples to apples, out of the box Glock to out of the box Smith & Wesson M&P, I think it's a better gun. Also, if you like kind of the fit and feel of a 1911, but you want a more modern, simpler polymer striker fire design, Smith & Wesson M&P. And if you like American made, if that means something to you, if that's important to you, Smith & Wesson M&P. I think it's only reasonable and prudent to compare them to the Glock, since that's its biggest competitor. How do they compare? Well, we covered American made, we covered ergonomics, I think goes with the Smith & Wesson M&P, and we covered aftermarket support, no doubt goes to the Glock. As a person that's done a lot of work to both platforms, I'm going to tell you, I think that the lower, the receiver, the polymer part with the metal inserts that you get on both a Glock and a Smith & Wesson M&P, I think that the better design, with one exception, goes to the Smith & Wesson M&P. It's got big, beefy inserts, quite a bit beefier than you'll see on a Glock. It also lends itself to be worked on quite easily. One exception, I think that they have this little lever that you push down if you're not familiar with the M&P. One of the kind of safety issues with the Glock, and I wouldn't fault Glock and the design for this, that's why I'm hitting the Smith & Wesson M&P for it. It's not unknown for police officers to shoot themselves or somebody else or have an ND in the cleaning room or whatever it is with a Glock because you have to pull the trigger to disassemble it. The Smith & Wesson has a little lever when you look at the lower that you can push down to be able to disassemble it. It moves that sear so that the top part will come off without having to pull the trigger. I think that's a kind of a safety measure that's not needed, and it adds a little bit of complexity that otherwise wouldn't be necessary in the lower of the Smith & Wesson M&P. That said, I've never heard of one breaking or causing the weapon to not function, and I've got quite a bit of trigger time with the Smith & Wesson M&P, but I think it's superfluous. I don't think it needs to be there. Both have a segmented trigger, both the original M&P and the original Glocks. They do it in a different way. The Smith & Wesson M&P has a segmented trigger in the middle, meaning the top and the bottom is kind of jointed, kind of like think of it as an elbow, and the whole thing has to be pulled. If you just drop it or something like that, the idea is that's the drop safety. Much like one of the drop safeties, much like on the Glock, except for the Glock has that little, often referred to as a dingus. It's just got a little protrusion, a protuberance in the middle of the Glock trigger that hangs out in the middle. For ergonomics sake, I think the Smith & Wesson M&P has a better design. And I'm going to be honest, if we're talking about trigger pulls, a factory trigger pull on the Glocks are pretty bad. Factory trigger pulls on the Gen 1 Smith & Wesson M&Ps are probably they're worse. I'm going to be fair, they're worse. They do break in over time. My competition pistol has an amazing trigger, which I have done some work to. I won't deny that. They can have very good triggers. But just out of the box, brand new, the first generation triggers are pretty bad. And that's one of the big downfalls of the gun, I think. Some of the very new generations of the Smith & Wesson M&P have pretty good triggers, and I would argue better than a Glock factory trigger. But just being fair there, the original one, the trigger is nothing to write home about. It's not great. Now moving on to the upper. I mentioned the sights out of the box, no question. I think the sights are better on a Smith & Wesson M&P. Talking about the slide of the Smith & Wesson M&P is stainless. Even if it's got that black coating, I believe I could be wrong about this, but I believe all Smith & Wesson M&P slides, and I'm not familiar with like the EZ or the Shields, I'm talking about the full-size fighting handgun M&Ps, are stainless. I like stainless. I like it a lot. I think it's got better ergonomics and better looks, if that is important to you, than the Glock. I will concede the factory Smith & Wesson barrels I don't think are as good as the factory Glock barrels. I like the finish that Glock puts on their barrels. They have a really high quality finish, really impervious to the elements. The factory M&P barrels kind of just look like a bluing or a parkerization. I don't believe they're nitrided. So I'm going to give the advantage on the barrels to the Glock. This one caveat. The older Gen 3s, Gen 1, Gen 2, 3, and 4, they all have that polygonal rifling. If you read the Glock manuals, you're not supposed to shoot lead ammo out of that. I don't mean copper jacketed lead ammo. I just mean straight lead slugs. Light cast lead. You're not supposed to shoot lead ammo out of those. You can shoot that out of the M&P if that matters to you. Most modern ammunition is copper jacketed, so you don't really have to worry about it. That said, if that applies to you want to reload on the cheap or make your own ammo, that might be a consideration. I think the quality of a Glock barrel is better than a factory M&P barrel. That said, I have a Storm Lake in my competition gun. I've had it for years and years and years in there. But I will concede, if I'm just comparing barrels, I think Glock has the better barrel. The guide rods are pretty similar. I don't think there's enough difference there to actually compare those. Here's the big advantage to the Glock, to be fair. The whole Glock upper assembly, generally, you can disassemble it pretty easy. You can, if you know what I'm talking about, take off the base plate and then the striker and pretty much everything else, the extractor. All that comes out, so you just have that one machine part, which makes it really easy to get a deep, deep clean. The Smith & Wesson M&P has a flaw in the upper in this, I believe, in that plunger, the drop safe, if you know what I'm talking about, that drop safe plunger, like would be on, is colloquially referred to as a Series 80 1911, which most polymer striker-fired handguns have. You have to remove the rear sight to get that out. I don't like that. I think that's a poor design choice. On the Smith & Wesson M&P, that's an advantage on the Glock. Also, the extractor is not easily taken out. That said, one of the big advantages of the M&P, I think it has a better extractor. Glock extractors do break. I have never seen nor heard of, nor even in my competition gun, which I couldn't even fathom the amount of rounds I've had through it, have I ever had the beefy, big, giant tool steel extractor on the Smith & Wesson M&P go out of tune or break or have any issues. That thing is way, way beefier, I think, and better than a Glock extractor. That said, it's not easily removable. The Glock extractor, if it does break and you have a spare, it's super easy to replace. The Smith & Wesson M&P is less so. It has a roll pin that I believe you're supposed to drive out one way. It's just not as user-friendly for replacement. That said, I've never needed to replace one. But to be fair, I think they could have designed it in such a way that if you did need to replace it, it would be easier. The Smith & Wesson M&P 2.0. As I said, I think in general they have better triggers, and the newer versions have even better triggers. Just pulled the trigger there, dry firing, if you can hear that. But I think that the newer versions have a little bit better trigger, and if you look at the new design, they even have a different shape trigger. That style of trigger that I have pulled is much better. Here's where I think they went the wrong direction in the Gen 2. I really like that part that hangs off the back of the Smith & Wesson M&P Gen 1s. It looks very much like a extended beaver tail on a nice custom 1911. I like that for fast draw. I like it a lot. Kind of guides my hand into the right spot high up, that good proper modern handgun, fighting handgun grip technique. I like that it guides that in there, and I'm much less likely to grab the back of the gun because it guides it into the right place. They got rid of that. I assume because a lot of people buy stuff on paper, and you can make the gun seemingly appear smaller because it has a less overall length by just cutting that beaver tail off. But I think it was the wrong move, to be fair. I much prefer the old beaver tail, extended beaver tail on the Gen 1s. Now, to give credit where credit is due, I looked on Wikipedia to see if there was any other differences. They talk about the steel chassis difference in the Gen 2s. And I did disassemble both ones that I have. My wife has a full-size Smith & Wesson M&P. It's her go-to full-size handgun. It's her only full-size handgun. She had it before she met me. She's got good taste, by God's grace, both in handguns and men, apparently. But seriously, it does actually have a different steel chassis system in there. When I say chassis system, that's what Smith & Wesson calls it. Now, it's not a chassis system like the 320, 250, M17 where you can like pull it out and put in a different grip module, but that's what they call it. It does appear different. It actually appears beefier in the Gen 2 when I disassembled them and looked at them. Not really sure what the end user difference there would be, but that is a difference. Now I'd like to talk about some of the really cool variants. My favorite variant, this gun, the Smith & Wesson M&P, per Wikipedia says it came out in 2005. The one that I am holding right now as I'm recording, my old competition gun, I probably got in 2000, I don't know, somewhere between 2009, 10-ish if I'm guessing, maybe later. But I've had this old girl a long time. I've had it so long, this is one of the ones, I said stainless steel, it actually has a silver just stainless steel slide. I'm not aware that they do that anymore. Most of them are just black on black, but back in the day you could get them in a two-tone. It's a Pro Series. And that's the one I'm talking about, a great variant, the Pro Series. The Gen 1 Pro Series with the extended barrel, it's just phenomenal. It's got phenomenal ergonomics, phenomenal balance, phenomenal combat accuracy. I shot this in USPSA Production Division. I shot it in Steel Challenge. I shot it and won, again, more shooting competitions than I can remember. It's a phenomenal gun, and I like... When I think full-size gun, I think 5-inch barrel. I don't think like a 4 or 4.5. To me, that's a compact gun. The Pro Series with the extended slide, the Gen 1s are amazing. They still make them in the Gen 2. That's an amazing variant of the Smith & Wesson M&P. On that note, if you are getting the Gen 1s, I think it does make sense to get the upgraded trigger package in there. Now, I adopted the M&P very early on, and I did the trigger work myself because I was unaware of anybody that made aftermarket stuff for them. Maybe they made an aftermarket sear or something. But I did a lot of that work myself, polishing and grinding, and just hours upon hours of messing with the trigger. They make a lot more options now. If you were to get an old Gen 1 and give it some new life, the M&P Pro Series, I would recommend that because the triggers aren't great out of the box. The newer Gen 2 and the Competition Pro models, and they should say Pro on them, like they'll say Pro on the slide. Mine says M&P Pro Series. they may have a better trigger out of the box. And the newer ones, I believe some of the newer ones are optics ready. This came out at a time when the only real optics were in like USPSA Open Division. We didn't, I don't think, have them the way we think about them today in like a reciprocating slide mounting system. Anyway, really cool, really awesome variant. Another really cool variant is the VTAC. The VTAC was a really cool variant of the Smith & Wesson M&P. It had some pretty cool day-night sights. It had a really cool finish. It was just a cool all-around variant of the Smith & Wesson M&P. Now, these did come in when 40 was a hot thing. Unlike Glock, where they had some early issues because they had a 9mm that they just tried to shove a 40 into, I think. And they had some issues early on with the 40 cals. The M&P, I think, was designed from the ground up for the 40, and then since it was designed for the more powerful cartridge, going to the 9mm was pretty easy. That said, there were some versions that were available in 357 SIG as well. Those are really cool variants. Pretty rare, but they did exist. You might be able to find one. I don't think in the Gen 2, but in the older Gen 1s. I think you can get them in 357 SIG. Or if you have a 40, a conversion barrel. But that's a pretty cool variant in and of itself. Know that they come in different sizes. The Pro Series is what I would consider a full-size fighting handgun, but what they consider their full size is more akin to a Glock 17-ish, and they make the compact. And they also make the shields. I'm not talking about those because I think that's a radically different design. The shields, the Shield EZs, maybe that's its own episode. I'm talking about the full design of the Smith & Wesson M&P Pro, full-size, compact. They're all pretty much the same with minor differences in size, but the overall design is the same. I'm not talking about the shields or the EZs or the anything like that. They also make a large frame version, much like Glock when they have their 9mm, 357, SIG, 40 Smith & Wesson, like size frame. They also have a bigger, beefier 45 and 10mm frame. Smith & Wesson does the same thing. They have the Smith & Wesson M&P 45 and recently the Smith & Wesson M&P 10mm. I don't know why it took them so long to make a 10mm. I do believe Glock made the 10mm before they even made a 45. Don't know why it took them so long, but they also make those. Let's call it the big boy of the M&P world. But if you're looking for a bigger, beefier version or a good 10mm or 45 handgun, you don't want a 1911 for whatever reason, but you want 1911 ergonomics, you may look at a large frame. That's what I'm going to call them. I don't know what Smith & Wesson calls them, but a large frame Smith & Wesson M&P. Anyway, I think that's pretty much going to wrap up the Smith & Wesson M&P episode. I think it's a really good handgun that probably deserves a lot more of the market share than it has. Seems like a new polymer striker-fired handgun coming out all the time, but that doesn't make them better than a Smith & Wesson M&P. They're a phenomenal American-made 21st century combat handgun. Great ergonomics, stainless steel slide. I mean, they're just a really good handgun. Tactical tip of the day. I'm going to pick one pertaining to the Smith & Wesson M&P. Those back straps, they're a different material than the regular frame, and they're quite easy to stipple. And if you ruin one, you can order a new one. You're not destroying the entire frame like you would if you were stippling a Glock frame. And unlike the small Glock back straps, they wrap quite a bit around the frame of the gun. So if you want to give stippling a shot on a gun, but you don't want to run the risk of ruining the entire gun, you can easily stipple the Smith & Wesson M&P inserts, the grip inserts. Also, along those same lines, if you don't know the part of the grip that you twist off to change the inserts, that's actually a tool to completely disassemble your Smith & Wesson M&P that's inserted into the grip of the handgun. That's a pretty cool design feature. It's its own punch. And that's really cool. If you didn't know that, if you're a Smith & Wesson M&P aficionado, you probably do. But for just the average casual observer looking at guns in a gun cabinet trying to decide which one to pick, you might not know that. That's a pretty cool design feature of the M&P. It has a disassembly tool built right into the grip that's actually functional, that holds the interchangeable grip panels in. Pretty neat. The tactical verse of the day. Just did one on body armor. And I thought about this later. This would have been a great one for that episode, but I'm going to put it in this one. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, having done all to stand. As you listen to the bio, you may have surmised that I've led a much more, let's call it, tactical life than a lot of people. But those battles, those external battles, pale in comparison to spiritual battles, the battlefield of your mind. Wrestling with your own mind can be sometimes so much more difficult than a physical struggle. And I think we all need help, if we're honest, in that struggle from time to time. So go to God. God is the one. He is the author of all strength. He's where all strength comes from. If you need strength, if you need help, you go to God. With that, men, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.